The therapist's silence. A man in a sharp gray suit sat in the parking garage of the medical center, his hands steady as he gripped the cold steel of a crowbar. In 13 hours, he would confess to burying 5 people under fresh concrete. The therapist who knew all their names would choose silence. And in the basement archives of the psychiatric hospital, sealed records from 1984 would finally explain why a man becomes a monster, and why some secrets are kept by those who understand them best. That morning had begun like any other. The rain came down in sheets across the city, turning the streets into rivers of gray light. Elias Thorne's apartment sat 40 stories above it all, suspended in the clouds like a sanctuary. His hand, pale and lined at the knuckles, gripped the handle of a stainless steel kettle. He filled it at the sink, watching the water rush from the tap as rain streaked the window behind it. The city lights blurred into a gray smear below, indistinguishable from the sky. He had not slept. His thumb traced the marble countertop as steam began to rise from the kettle's spout. The sound of rushing water filled the small kitchen, mixing with the heavy percussion of rain against the glass. Elias moved methodically, filling the kettle, waiting for it to heat, preparing for a day like any other. But there was something in his movements that suggested hurry, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. At 6:15, he walked to the front door. The manila envelope lay exactly where it had been slipped under the door sometime during the night. Elias bent down, his movements slow and deliberate. His thumb brushed the rough paper. No stamps, no return address. Just the weight of it in his hands, and the feeling that something had shifted in the world while he slept. Or tried to. He returned to the kitchen and placed the envelope on the marble island. The silver letter opener was cold in his hand as he worked it into the seal. The paper tore with a thin whisper of sound. Inside was a single polaroid and a typed note on a 5x7 index card. The photograph showed him from behind, entering his office building. The timestamp read, yesterday, 2:47 p.m. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note. The type was uniform and impersonal, the kind of precision that came from a machine, not a human hand. Some secrets should stay buried, Doctor. Stop the sessions. Elias dropped the note onto the kitchen island as if it had burned him. He looked at his medical license, framed on the wall in gold. The seal caught the dull morning light and threw it back in fractured rays. He exhaled slowly, and the sound filled the entire apartment. The kettle continued to whistle, forgotten. He picked up his leather briefcase, checked the brass latches with his fingers, and headed for the door. The manila envelope and the note remained on the counter, abandoned like debris from another life. He locked the deadbolt behind him with a definitive click. The kitchen clock showed 6:30 a.m. By 7:45, Elias was descending into the underground parking garage of the medical center. His silver Volvo sat in its reserved space, the paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He clicked the key fob. The lights flashed orange. The sound echoed through the cavernous space as he began walking toward the elevator, his heels clicking on the concrete in a steady, measured rhythm. The shadows between the cars stretched like dark fingers across the floor. He was alert, scanning the emptiness around him, when a figure in a dark hoodie lunged from behind a concrete pillar. The movement was sudden and violent. A heavy crowbar whistled through the air toward Elias's head, aimed at a killing angle. Elias ducked. The crowbar connected with the driver's side window of his Volvo. Glass exploded outward like diamonds catching the fluorescent light, scattering across the floor in 1,000 glittering pieces. The impact point left a spiderweb of cracks around the impact crater. His survival instinct took over. He swung his leather briefcase upward, ramming it into the attacker's solar plexus with all the force his body could generate. The sound of impact was dull and brutal. The attacker gasped for air, stumbling backward. Elias grabbed the attacker's wrist and twisted, trying to disarm him. They scuffled against the car door, metal groaning under their combined weight. The crowbar fell from the attacker's hand and clattered on the concrete. The attacker kicked out wildly, his heel connecting with Elias's shin. Pain shot up Elias's leg. He was limping, his grip loosening, when the attacker shoved him backward and fled toward a black SUV parked 3 spaces down. The engine roared to life. Tires screeched against the concrete. The license plate was obscured by mud. Deliberate, Elias noted through the fog of adrenaline. He leaned against his car, hand pressed to his bruised chin, breathing in ragged gasps. His eyes scanned the debris of the struggle. Glass, scattered papers that had spilled from his briefcase. And then he saw it. A small gold cufflink, shaped like a serpent, lay on the cool concrete floor. He picked it up. The metal was warm in his palm, still holding the heat from the attacker's wrist. The serpent's scales were detailed, precise, the work of a craftsman. He turned it over in his fingers and knew, with absolute certainty, that he had seen this design before. The parking garage around him seemed to contract and expand simultaneously. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. The rain continued to fall somewhere above him, though here in the subterranean darkness, the world seemed sealed and final. At 9 o'clock, Julian and Clara Sterling sat in his office. Elias occupied his leather chair. A notebook balanced on his lap. His pen rested against the page, ready to record the performance that was about to unfold. Julian Sterling adjusted his silk tie with the precision of a man accustomed to perfect surfaces. His charcoal suit had been tailored by someone who understood power. Clara Sterling sat at the far end of the sofa, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the floor where she did not have to see her husband. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked its endless rhythm. Elias's shin throbbed beneath his pant leg. "We've been discussing the foundation," Julian said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Clara believes I'm not fully transparent about the charitable work. I assure her I am." Elias wrote nothing. He watched. Julian reached for a glass of water on the side table. As his sleeve retracted, Elias saw his right cuff clearly. It was empty. Otherwise, Elias felt the cufflink against his ribs, where he had transferred it into his shirt pocket. He looked from the folder to Julian's face, to the empty right cuff. The pieces of information assembled themselves in his mind with the precision of a geometric proof. His patient had tried to kill him an hour ago in the parking garage. That evening, at 8 o'clock, Elias used his key card to enter the basement archives of the medical center. The magnetic lock clicked green, and the heavy door swung inward on its hinges. The space beyond was a cathedral of metal shelving and cardboard boxes, lit by sensor-activated lights that clicked on as he moved through the aisles. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. The industrial HVAC system hummed its monotonous song. Yellow labels on dusty boxes passed him like mile markers as he moved deeper into the stacks. He knew what he was looking for. In the back corner, near a section labeled Closed Cases 1995 to 2010, he found it. A box labeled Sterling Closed Case 2004. He pulled it down. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as they fell through the air. The papers inside were brittle with age. Court documents, police reports, and photographs. One image showed a much younger Julian Sterling standing in a police lineup, his face thin and hollow, his eyes empty. The date stamp read, March 1984. Elias was so focused on the document that he almost didn't notice the light. The sensor light at the end of the aisle clicked on suddenly, flooding the space with brightness. Two men in tactical vests appeared as if summoned by that light itself. One held a heavy-duty mag light, the beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The other held a taser, the prongs catching the fluorescent glow. Their boots were heavy on the concrete as they advanced. Elias's mind calculated the distance, the options, the probability of escape. He found a combination he could live with. He hurled the heavy file box at the first thug's head. Papers exploded outward like birds from a burning nest, documents fluttering through the air. He charged the second man, shoulder first, driving him backward into the metal shelving. Boxes tumbled down around them. Metal groaned under the impact. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Elias kicked the first man in the stomach as he tried to rise, the air leaving his lungs in a grunt of pain. He grabbed a single adoption record from the floor. He didn't even know why, just that his hand closed around it, and sprinted toward the emergency exit. The red exit sign glowed above the door like a promise. Behind him, boots clattered against concrete. He hit the door hard. The alarm began to wail, a sound so loud and complete that the entire building seemed to be screaming. At 10:30 that night, Clara Sterling opened the door to a small, modest apartment. There was no marble here, no silk or expensive furnishings, just functional furniture and the smell of rain coming through a slightly open window. She was wearing a simple sweater, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She looked terrified. Elias entered, still bleeding slightly from a cut on his cheek. His jacket was torn along the seam. He placed the adoption record on the small kitchen table and waited. Clara looked at the document, then at him. She opened her laptop without speaking. Her fingers found the keyboard through muscle memory alone. She hit the spacebar. An audio file began to play. The voice that emerged from the speakers was Elias's own, recorded during a session weeks earlier. His professional, concerned tone filled the small apartment. "Are you saying Julian threatened the child?" the recorded Elias asked. Clara allowed the playback to continue for a moment, then paused it. She turned the laptop to face him and opened a folder. Inside were dozens of audio files, each one labeled with a date and time. "I've recorded every session for a year," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, emptied of emotion. Every word, every confession. She slid a USB drive across the table. It had a small piece of blue tape on it. Written on that tape, in careful black marker, were two words: truth, including the ones where he confessed to the accidents at the construction sites. Clara continued. The workers who died. The foreman who asked too many questions. All of it. He described their deaths to you, and you nodded and asked follow-up questions about his childhood. Elias picked up the USB drive. It was warm in his hand, as if it had been holding the heat of all those secrets, all those confessions. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The rain intensified against the window. "Why?" he asked. "Because he had to tell someone," Clara said. "And he chose you. He chose you because he knew you couldn't tell anyone else." She was right. The professional silence that should have protected her husband had instead become his armor, his shield against consequences. The same silence that kept vulnerable people safe had kept a murderer walking free. At midnight, a man in a sharp gray suit sat in the waiting room outside Elias's office. His name was Marcus Vane, and he was checking a gold pocket watch with the precision of someone for whom time was currency. Elias entered from the hallway. Vane stood slowly, his movements economical and controlled. He handed Elias a legal document with a red, urgent stamp across the top. The paper was heavy cream-colored bond. The Sterling family crest was embossed at the top of the letterhead. "A restraining order," Vane said, his voice clinical and rehearsed. "And a notice of malpractice lawsuit. You have 8 hours to surrender all files on the Sterling family." Elias read the document without comprehension. The words seemed to float on the page, refusing to cohere into meaning. Vane leaned in closer. He tapped the watch face. 12:05 a.m. "After that, the police won't be the ones coming for you. Julian loses his patience after dawn." The lawyer walked out through the glass doors of the office, his footsteps barely audible on the carpet. Elias looked at the security camera in the corner of the waiting room. It had been spray-painted black. The paint was still wet in places, dripping down the lens in thin rivulets. He crumpled the legal document in his hand. From his bag, he withdrew the USB drive. He looked at his desk phone. 8 hours, Vane had said. 8 hours to choose between his career and his life. 8 hours to decide whether the secret he had kept would die with him or live in the form of evidence. The digital clock on his phone blinked 12:08. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Elias was driving his Volvo through rain-slicked streets at speeds that made the engine scream. His hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, 2 sets of headlights were closing in on him, maintaining distance but never losing sight. He took a left turn. The car fishtailed slightly, the tires fighting for purchase on the wet asphalt. The city blurred around him, streetlights creating halos in the falling rain. A black SUV rammed his rear bumper. His head snapped back against the headrest, hard enough to make his vision swim. The car drifted across 2 lanes before he regained control. Sparks flew from the collision point as metal met metal. Elias swerved into a narrow alleyway. The SUV followed, clipping a row of trash cans. Plastic barrels exploded across the wet street like toys. He slammed on his brakes, shifted into reverse, and rammed the SUV's front grille. The impact jolted his entire body. Steam rose from the SUV's radiator, clouds of it rising into the cold night air. A man leaned out the SUV window with a pistol. The first shot shattered Elias's passenger window. Glass showered into the interior, glittering fragments catching the street light. Elias ducked, steering with one hand, and gunned the engine. The muzzle flash lit up the narrow alley like a strobe. 2 more shots cracked through the rain. He cleared the alley and weaved through a construction zone. Orange barrels formed a maze, and he navigated through it with desperate precision, losing his pursuers behind a wall of safety equipment. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pulled into a darkened gas station. The engine ticked as it cooled. Elias sat motionless, his hands still gripping the wheel. In the mirror, he could see his own reflection, bloody, terrified. A man who had crossed some invisible line and could not go back. He drove the rest of the way to Sarah Miller's house, using every back street and residential road he could find. Sarah Miller, the district attorney, opened the door in a silk robe. She looked unsurprised to see him. "Come in," she said. And the tone of her voice told him everything before anything had even begun to go wrong. She poured him a glass of brandy with steady hands. Elias sat on her leather sofa, the USB drive on the coffee table between them. The fireplace had dying embers in it, and the room smelled of aged wood and expensive furniture. "It's all there," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting and adrenaline. "Everything. Murders disguised as accidents, bribes, construction site deaths. It's the end for him." Sarah did not pick up the USB drive. She looked at the door instead. Then she walked to a desk and pulled out a file. The Heritage Foundation logo was emblazoned across the folder. She laid a check on top of it. $100,000, signed by Julian Sterling. "I know," she said. Then she picked up the phone. She didn't dial 911. She hit a single speed dial button. "Julian? He's here." "Yes. The drive, too. Come finish this." Elias reached for the brandy glass without thinking. He took a long drink. The liquid was smooth going down, with an odd oily film on top. By the time he realized what was happening, his vision was already blurring at the edges. He tried to stand. His legs did not obey. The room began to spin in concentric circles, and then there was only darkness. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Rope, or something like rope. Plastic binding, tight around his wrists. The smell of dust and metal oxidation. Wind howling through empty spaces. Elias opened his eyes. He was zip-tied to a rusted rebar pillar inside a half-finished skyscraper. The skeleton of the building surrounded him, concrete floors and exposed girders rising into dimness. The wind whistled through the open spaces, carrying the sound of the distant city 40 stories below. His head throbbed. His mouth tasted like bitter chemicals. Julian Sterling walked into view, holding the USB drive. He was wearing a yellow high-visibility vest over his expensive suit, a costume that transformed him into something between a businessman and a laborer. He looked like a king surveying his domain. The first hint of pink sun was appearing on the horizon. "You thought a little plastic toy would stop a legacy?" Julian said. His voice carried the weight of complete certainty. "You thought a therapist's recordings would matter?" He held the USB over the edge of the building. Elias followed its trajectory as it fell, spinning into the gray abyss of clouds and distance below. They watched it vanish into nothing together, and in that moment, Elias understood that his life had already ended. "Suicide due to professional stress," Julian continued. "It fits your profile perfectly. A man destroyed by his inability to help his patients. We'll find you at dawn. The fall will be merciful." He signaled to a henchman standing by a forklift. The diesel engine roared to life. The machine began to advance, its metal prongs nudging a heavy pallet of bricks toward Elias's position. The pallet inched closer to the edge of the building where Elias was bound. The wind carried the sound of concrete creaking. Elias looked at his hands. The zip ties were tight, cutting off circulation, but they were not impossible. In his clenched fist, he still held the gold serpent cufflink. He had never released it. Not through the chase, not through the drugging, not through the drive to this place. His palm had formed a fist around it so tight that the sharp gold tail had begun to cut into his skin. He began to move the cufflink against the plastic ties, finding the angle of maximum leverage, the point where the sharp tail could catch and cut. The plastic began to fray. The pallet continued its inexorable advance. Julian watched with the satisfaction of a man who had already won. The wind continued to howl. The dawn continued to break. The zip ties snapped. Elias lunged as the henchman stepped off the forklift. He grabbed a loose piece of rebar and swung it with everything remaining in his body. The metal connected with the man's knees with a sound like struck bone. The henchman screamed and fell. Julian pulled a small snub-nosed revolver from beneath his vest. Elias did not run. He stood his ground and he began to speak, not as a victim, but as a therapist. His voice was loud enough to carry over the wind, authoritative and clinical. "You're doing exactly what your father did in 1984, Julian. The basement, the discipline. You're just a scared boy in a suit." Julian flinched. The mention of his father, the secret Elias had uncovered in the basement archives, caused something to fracture in his eyes. His hand trembled. The gun wavered. Elias tackled him. They rolled across the dusty concrete. The gun fired, a wild shot into the air that echoed off the girders. They grappled near the edge of the building, dust clouds kicking up around them. Elias managed to pin Julian's arm, and instead of pushing him off, instead of allowing him to fall, Elias grabbed the radio from Julian's vest and clicked the broadcast button. The static burst filled the air between them. "This is Dr. Elias Thorne," he said into the radio. His voice was steady. "I am at the Sterling construction site. The man I am holding has confessed to 5 murders, possibly more." From the speaker came the voice of the chief of police. "We have you on an open channel, Mr. Sterling. We copy. Stay where you are." Julian's face went pale. He looked at the horizon. Police cruisers with blue and red lights were swarming the base of the building like insects converging on a corpse. The sirens had already begun their wail, a sound that seemed to shake the very steel of the building. The elevator dinged. Clara Sterling stepped out into the morning light, escorted by 2 officers. She held another USB drive, a backup she had created and hidden, a failsafe that she had never told anyone about. Her eyes met Elias's across the wide expanse of concrete and steel. He walked toward the elevator, leaving Julian to the officers and their handcuffs. His shin throbbed. His wrists bled from where the cufflink had cut him. His ribs felt bruised. But he walked. As he passed the pile of bricks, he paused. He picked up the gold serpent cufflink from where it had fallen during the struggle. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the precise craftsmanship of the serpent's scales. He handed it to the lead officer. "Evidence," he said. Then he continued toward the elevator. 3 months later, Elias sat at a desk in a modest office. The plaque on the door read, "Victim Advocacy Consultant." He was signing a statement for the court, the pen moving across the paper in his careful handwriting. Bright, clear sunlight filled the room. The kind of sunlight that only came after weeks of rain had finally passed. The city outside his window looked clean and new, though Elias knew that beneath that surface, the same darkness that had always existed remained. He finished signing his name and set the pen down. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a photograph, old and creased at the edges. It showed a young Elias, no more than 30 years old, with a woman who had Clara Sterling's distinctive eyes. The back of the photograph bore a handwritten note. To Elias, keep the secret safe. 1985. He had known for a long time that he was Clara's biological father. He had known it when she was born. He had known it through her childhood, through her adolescence, through her adulthood. And he had never told her. That secret, at least, he had kept perfectly. He closed the drawer. The phone on his desk rang. He picked it up and answered with a calm, new authority that came from having seen into the deepest places of human motivation and survived to speak about it. "This is Elias," he said. "How can I help you find the truth?" He began to take notes as the voice on the other end spoke about a situation that required his particular expertise. His pen moved across the page, creating the geometric patterns of documentation, of evidence, of the slow accumulation of facts that might someday save someone. The gold serpent cufflink sat on his desk, now serving as a paperweight. The serpent's head had been crushed under heavy glass, the scales flattened beneath the transparent weight. The office was quiet, except for the sound of Elias's pen and the voice on the phone. Outside, the city moved on. Cars drove past. People walked on sidewalks. The ordinary machinery of life continued its endless rotation. But in this small office, a man who had been destroyed by silence was learning, slowly, to speak. The light from the window faded gradually as the afternoon moved toward evening. Elias worked through it all, his notes accumulating page after page, his voice calm and steady as he listened to the stories that people needed to tell. The photograph in the drawer remained closed and hidden, kept safe by a man who understood that some truths saved lives, while others destroyed them. The distinction had taken him a lifetime to learn. But he had learned it. And in the learning, something that might have been called survival had finally begun.